Good morning, everyone. It is 8:39 right now, and it is time to visit with our good friend Rekha Basu from Good Morning Register to find out what in the world is going on in this town of ours. And Jackie, it has, of course.
Yes.
Just a friendly reminder, if you're looking for the perfect gift for someone in your family, friends, a subscription to the Register.
Yes.
Always a great idea. Let's support a great local paper that we have here in our community.
What's really handy is the digital version.
That
is really handy.
Yes, absolutely.
And you get both.
Thank you, Jackie,
both.
for saying that. That's really true.
But speaking of which, if you turn to the last page of today's Des Moines Register.
16A, 15A. I'm short-sighted. Yeah, my column today. Actually, this is a difficult subject, a sad subject, an emotional subject for many people. But it's also in my today's column got a personal twist, and that is the right to die and the right to physician-assisted suicide. And in the case that I'm writing about today, this is a story involving Dan Johnston, a personal friend, who was the former county attorney, who was the attorney who argued before the U.S. Supreme Court in the Tinker versus Des Moines Independent School District case about allowing student free speech rights by wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War back in the 60s. So Dan has been an ardent civil libertarian. He was with the American Civil Liberties Union at that time in the 60s when he argued this case, and subsequently has made he served in the Iowa legislature, and he's been an activist and an advocate on civil liberties, on civil rights, on criminal justice reform, on a variety of causes. And the interesting thing, so he was suffering from a kind of cancer, a rare kind of skin cancer called Merkel cell carcinoma. And it was his second bout with cancer in a couple of years, and he knew that the outlook was not good. And he decided, having been in the hospital for a while, that he wanted to be moved to hospice and he wanted to just die. He wanted to give up trying. But there was no way to legally end his life or have assistance of a physician or anyone at the hospice to give him the medication that would do that. So what he ended up having to do is just starve himself gradually by taking only water and no food. Now, Dan was a friend of mine, and I didn't know that he was in such bad shape. I had no idea he was in hospice, but I got an email, ironically, from the nurse who had taken care of my late husband, Rob, when he was sick with ALS, exactly. And she said, Dan is in hospice, he loves you and Rob, he would love a visit. So I went. And that was exactly 1 week ago. I went to see him on Wednesday. And it was, I guess the bottom line about this story is that the way that I got to really know Dan, I had known Dan over the years. He was living in New York a lot of that time, but he had written me emails from New York about a lot of the crusades that I was waging in my newspaper column about police brutality and about the need for civilian review boards and the need for district attorneys who would actively prosecute officers who appeared to be guilty of infringing on people's human rights. And he talked about, he shared a perspective of when he had been the county attorney and what he was up against trying to do that, but how important it was, and, just encouraging me along. But the time that I really got to know him was back 14 years ago when Louise Noun, the late Louise Noun, she was a great philanthropist, and she was the president of the ACLU, and she was also a very prominent personality as a feminist in Iowa and nationally, in fact. She was a friend of mine, and she introduced me to Dan. And she also decided when she was 94 years old that she had had enough time on this earth, and there were little things happening in her brain that just made living quite intolerable. And her only daughter was dying, had died actually, and she just decided it was time to go. And she enlisted me in what she called her final project. She asked me to come to her apartment. We sat and talked, and she said, I can't legally obtain the means to end my life, and it's not fair, and the laws need to be changed around that. And she said, I plan to do it regardless. I'm going to find a way to do it, and I want you to tell my story after I'm gone, but we can't say anything about it now because somebody could be criminally prosecuted.
Right.
And another person who she told about this was Dan Johnston. So they were two of the very few people she let into her plan. And Dan was the one, because he was a lawyer, who was actually left to sort of make sure that her wishes were carried out. So I was really having an internal struggle with this whole right to die issue because, you know, even if intellectually I could understand it, I was trying to argue with her that she still had reason to live and that she was still productive and that she was a friend of mine and I loved her and cared about her and so many people did. And she said, you know, you're talking selfishly. You're talking about yourself. You're not talking about me. My life is not meaningful or pleasurable anymore. You know, think about me and think about my needs. Mm-hmm. And while Dan was much more sort of supportive in the nuts and bolts practical aspects of that, I had a really hard time dealing with any of it, although I supported intellectually and theoretically her right to die. So at the time that she decided to do it, Dan paid me a visit in my office and said, it's coming soon, get your column ready. And I just fought back, you know, I called her, I went to visit her. He was annoyed. He was just kind of saying, like, back off, let her go. She's ready to go.
Right.
And then, you know, such a huge irony, it turns around that like 12, 14 years later, here I am sitting in his hospice room having the exact same conversation with him. And I had gone to visit him as a friend, but I said, Dan, is there anything you want to say to the world, you know, any message that you want me to convey? And he said, physician assistant suicide. It's really, really important. And he could barely talk. He was a shell of his former self. He was just gaunt, and he was slipping away, and because he was only having water, his voice had gone. He could speak, you know, in very slow whispers. And he used to be a formidable personality. He was someone who could be intimidating. I mean, he really commanded authority when he talked about an issue. And so, you know, imagine being there in this room and talking to him. And I said, well, so what is it about your life that's gotten so intolerable? You still have visitors and you still have, you know, there was this big arrangement of flowers and of pictures. And I said, you know, you still have people that love you. And he said, life is intolerable. I just want out.
Now, he was a lawyer, so
he was a lawyer.
Now, did you talk to him about your knowing this information and not sharing it? Were you in jeopardy of anything?
No, because he could. The only thing he could legally do was to withhold food, was to order them not to give him food. What he was not doing was stockpiling medication or asking a doctor to slip him a little something that would end his life. They were really controlling the amount of morphine that he was on, so he couldn't, you know, he couldn't overdose on it. So that's the only, and that's the sad thing. It's such a slow, drawn-out process, you know, dying by just taking water and starving yourself. But that's what he was forced to do. And it was such a poignant thing when I left his room. I remember, you know, telling him how important he was and how much I said, I love you. And I said, you know, maybe I'll get to see you again. And he said, I hope not. And that was it. 2 days later, he died. And as I wrote, I didn't take that personally. I got exactly where he was coming from. And though intellectually, I still support people's right to die when they are terminally ill or in pain after they've consulted with their doctor and know that there's really no hope of things changing. Emotionally, I don't think I ever will.
What was that like for you, being in that moment?
It was really painful. And, you know, I first came in and tried to make light of, you know, everything. Hey, Dan, how are you doing? Tried to be really casual because that's the way he was. And he just said, I'm dying. And he was able to be so honest about everything, no beating around the bush, no sugarcoating it. And as I wrote in the column, he wasn't going to try and make it easier for me, you know, by sugarcoating it and saying, oh, I'm fine, I'm feeling good, how are you, you know.
Because that's not who he is.
That's not who he was.
That's not
and
how he left us.
It was awful saying goodbye to him, but I also had so much respect for his decision.
So you're writing about this in today's paper. Is this now going to be a passion? Are you going to help tell the story of your friends?
I've told the story. I told Louise's story, I told his story, and I've written about other people. It's not a campaign I'm waging. It's not a series or anything like that. But when these cases come up on a personal basis that I have some connection to or some attachment to, I certainly will share
Now, what
them.
can people do about this?
Lobby the legislature. The legislature actually came close to passing a bill in one of the houses, I think, in the last session, because there were a couple of very noted cases that we had written about in the paper. But in the end, they're chicken. They don't want to do it. So, I mean, really, if you believe in this cause, lobby your state legislator and tell them how important it is.
Just get something done.
Yeah.
And you can read more about this amazing story in today's Des Moines Register.
There you go. Thank you, Rekha.
Thank you, Rekha. Thank you for sharing that personal story.